Okay, I think that covers most of the things about me. I will say about the talk that I should acknowledge that what I'm presenting is collaborative work with a whole bunch of people, including lots of students in my research group, which is the Community Data Science Collective, which is a really unusual multi-institution sort of lab that exists primarily at the University of Washington, Northwestern University, and Purdue. And then I want to particularly acknowledge the work of Aaron Shaw, whose work is a collaborator of mine for many, many years, whose fingerprints are all over this in various ways. Okay, I'm going to jump right into it. This is Wikipedia, and you all know Wikipedia, and you all know or will not be surprised to hear that it's depending on the week, between the sort of 5th and the 8th most popular website in the world in terms of the number of people that are viewing it. And you probably also know about its 2 most charming features or what I consider its 2 most charming features, because among other reasons, they're highlighted prominently on its front page. First, Wikipedia is free. It's free both in the sense that it's run by a nonprofit organization and distributed at no cost without advertisements under a very permissive license that allows sort of costless consumption as well as reuse by anyone with an internet connection anywhere. And in that sense, Wikipedia is a knowledge commons. That's like one of the 3 main concepts in my title. And the second bit is the second part. It's this anyone can edit bit. Wikipedia relies on all of us to build it. So if you go to the article on the University of Maryland College of Information Studies, there actually is an article also on the HCI lab, which is pretty good. I highlighted this one because it's not as good. In fact, since for the last 10 years, it's been highlighting with the fact that it reads like a press release and perhaps was written by someone in the organization. And if you happen to know something about this organization, you could try to fix that by pressing the edit button, which is also prominently located on every single page, about which few people press, and even among most people who do press the button never press save because they see something like this. It's like, oh my gosh, what is going on? It looks like code, but perhaps you're not scared away by that and you could fix the article. And through this process, Wikipedia is, like most of the knowledge commons that I'm going to be talking about today, is built through a process called peer production. Peer production is a term which was coined by Yochai Benkler, who was one of my mentors when I was a graduate student, as part of a theory that argues that new technologies, mostly the internet, have driven transaction costs associated with collective action. That is to say, sort of not the cost of making a contribution, but the extra costs associated with integrating that with other people. That those are now so low that it's allowed the emergence of this new form of collaborative production that lies outside of markets and firms. And of course, English Wikipedia is just the tip of the kind of peer production iceberg. There are something like 300, as of when I looked last week, 326 different language versions of Wikipedia. 15 of them have more than 1 million articles. And there are lots and lots of others examples of peer production projects, which are built through that same process of mass aggregation of many small contributions. You're very familiar, I'm sure, with free and open source software and all the stuff on GitHub, OpenStreetMap, Reddit, which is peer producing like a process of collaborative filtering. But there's Wikia, which has now been kind of mostly rebranded, but not 100%, as fandom.com, because it hosts wikis that are very similar to Wikipedia. They're using the same software, they work in the same way, and actually some of the work that I'll be showing you here is drawn from them. There are literally millions of peer production projects, or rather, there are millions of attempts to build peer production projects, the vast majority of which don't actually really attract that many peers. The median number of contributors to an open source software project, 1 person. But some of them do, many of them, thousands, tens of thousands of them, have become very successful and produced large knowledge goods in various ways. So I'm going to frame the rest of my talk in terms of 2 pieces of what I'm going to call bad news about peer production projects, and about English Wikipedia in particular, which will be kind of my case study that I'm talking about here. So this is bad news number 1, and the bad news is pretty clear once you sort of understand what's going on the graph. This is the number of active contributors to English Wikipedia, and active contributors is defined by the Wikimedia Foundation as people that have made at least 5 contributions in a given month. And you can see that it has been in decline since, well, we can say actually with some precision, it's been in decline since March 2007. And nothing happened in March 2007. Nothing obvious happened in March 2007. The iPhone was released in March 2007, but not that many people had them, right? Like, I mean, the things happen, plenty of things happened in March 2007, but it's not like Wikipedia. Oh yeah, that was the time we like rolled out the new website or like created some new policy, right? That doesn't seem that obvious answer doesn't seem to be the answer here. And this has led to an enormous amount of research, including a lot of what I would consider some of the research that I've done, not about Wikipedia, but about the sort of dynamics of volunteer mobilization. A lot of the work that I did in probably the first 5 or 6 years of my career. So anyway, there's more bad news because this is not just English Wikipedia. These are the 8 largest Wikipedia editions in terms of the number of edits. And I want to take you to take away a few things and hopefully speak to maybe, I mean, you're all smart people. You're probably thinking of some potential answers to this question. So there's a few things to point right away. The first is that this pattern is like pretty general, right? This pattern of what looks like kind of superlinear growth that translates into sort of like sublinear decline seems to happen over and over again across these large Wikipedia editions. Another thing to keep in mind is that this happens, that one really common answer that a lot of people are like, well, of course, that was probably maybe March 2007 is when English Wikipedia just like finished writing all the articles, right? Like, okay, like, well, what about Polish Wikipedia? Because if you look, these graphs look pretty similar, but the numbers on the y-axis are really different, right? So Polish Wikipedia, which has almost the same shape, right? Like peaked at 6,000 active editors. So unless you want to make the argument that there's a lot less to say about Polish than there is in English, that doesn't seem to be the answer. Another thing to keep in mind is that the peaks happen at different times. Look right above Polish. Look at Russian, right? Like Russian follows a very similar process, but peaked much, much later, right? Many of these did peak around 2007. They also started around the same time, or many of them did, but you actually see very different ones. I have lots of these graphs in like an appendix. Like, so like, if you want to see more of them, like, let's like, ask me in the questions, right? Okay. So, this pattern is very general. This is some work that was published in Chi in 2018, led by Nate Tablentais, who was a PhD student in our group, is now at the University of Michigan as a postdoc. And this is data from the top 1% of wikis on wikia.com, again, mostly rebranded as fandom.com. So most of these are fandom.com wikis right now. This is sort of like standardized along both axes. So along the x-axis is just like age. So this is like, these are wikis which are being founded at a bunch of different periods over about a 5-year period. And along the y-axis is just standard deviation units in terms of activity, right? So the maximum is going to be it's just like, just how much variation there are. And what you see immediately is that like this pattern seems to be this pattern of rise, like maturity and decline seems to be like very general across these other communities as well. And that, it seems to happen in a period of about 4 years. This is not just, I'm not gonna keep showing you graphs, although I would love to, but this is not just a story about Wikipedia or about wikis. The Linux Foundation has this group called CHAOSS, which is like a backronym that stands for Community Health and Analytics for Open Source Software. They have a growth, maturity, and decline working group because these patterns of growth, maturity, and decline seem to be features of a range of kinds of not peer-produced knowledge commons, right? And I guess I should point out one other thing, which is that this is not what it looks like. If you look at like social media sites, it doesn't look like this for the most part. What you see what I think most people expected to see, which is something that seems to be more like an S-shaped curve, like a logistic sort of like diffusion curve. It transitions into flattening, not transitions into decline. Okay, so let's see. Yeah. So I think that people are. So I think that's the first piece of bad news. Now I think that people are interested in peer production for 2 reasons. One is that it's created these enormous sources of value, right? Like we love Wikipedia. I mean, I love Wikipedia. Maybe you do too. The second is actually more about like how it's done it, right? This is 2 charming features of Wikipedia. It's a free encyclopedia and it's really big, and it does it while being really open. And openness is like a pretty vague. It's a large and vague concept. I'm sort of trained in organizational sociology, and so I think that like I'm going to try to hold myself back from like going really deep into that. But I will say, for the purposes of this talk, I want you to think about openness like as an institute, like in an institutional sense, which means think of it as the relative absence of formalization of rules or boundaries, right? And so a lot of people are really excited because Wikipedia doesn't have a lot of rules, or at least initially didn't have a lot of rules, and it was or a lot of boundaries. It's pretty easy to join, and that's the second piece of bad news in the talk. Because there's a large body of evidence, including a bunch of work that my group has done, that peer production projects are becoming less open as they grow. So A very quick review of what is a big stack of papers that I could point you to. There's a whole bunch of evidence. This is some work led by Brian Butler, which is like maybe the first piece of argument that the first paper that made this argument that in 2008 that showed that these communities, in this case English Wikipedia, is becoming increasing, has lots and lots of rules and lots of governance activity. So this is a paper called "Don't Look Now, But We've Created a Bureaucracy: The Nature and Roles of Policies and Rules in Wikipedia." Here's another paper, here's another book called the subtitle is Power Concentration and Self-Organizing Bureaucratization in the Evolution of Wikipedia. There are lots of rules and governance activity, and these things have increased over time. It's actually even worse than that, because peer production projects have also seem to become more oligarchic as they grow. I'll talk about this work. This is some work that I did now almost 10 years ago, that used some work from political sociology, this thing called the iron law of oligarchy, and sort of provided an empirical test of that using this data set of large wikis from Wikia, and showed that as these wikis become sort of like larger and more complex, that a small group of people present at the beginning consolidate power as their interests diverge from the rest of the membership. And peer production projects become more difficult to contribute to. So there was a very influential paper called "The Rise and Decline of an Open Collaboration System" that essentially argued, that provided an answer to this question, building off this earlier work, that suggested that the reason that English Wikipedia was declining in terms of active editors was not that because the faucet had been turned off, right? Like new users were continuing to show up at the rate at which they were before. What had changed was that through all these rules and through this oligarchic leadership, that the community was rejecting the work of newcomers at an increasingly high rate, and that as a result of this rejection, those newcomers were less likely to stick around. Increased rejection, decreased retention. And then we showed that this is in the same paper that I mentioned before, that Kai paper. We essentially replicated that finding in about 800 of the largest wikis on fandom.com. So this is all typically seen as a bad thing. And it's seen as a bad thing because, well, for a few reasons. One is that it was the openness of these systems in the first place, that in terms of their governance and participation, that attracted many to them in the first place. But it's also bad because it leads to less vibrant and productive communities, right? Like volunteers contributing are the lifeblood. Literally, they're the reasons that have like caused these communities to build these things of value in the first place. But it's also a puzzle, right? So if I've provided you with like kind of an answer to the question of why is Wikipedia declining, and the answer is like, well, it's rejecting all the people that are trying to contribute to it now, right? There's why is it why is it doing that? And so to the extent that like that first answer is part of what I and a bunch of other people have spent, maybe like, a big chunk of time working on this question, right? Why are they rejecting newcomers, like these people who are showing up and trying to contribute in ways at an increasingly high rate over time? That's been the thing that I've spent much of the last, like, let's say like 3 or 4 years working on. And that's part of what I'm going to be talking about. That's the rest of what I'll be talking about today. Before I give you the answer, there's one more thing I need to tell you, which is that there are 2 major theoretical models that scholars have used to understand peer production, and understanding like the full shape of my answer understands like I'm going to try to reconcile those 2 things together and provide an explanation. So I have to do that quickly. So the first 2 bodies of social theory actually treat peer production as different kinds of things, different sort of social processes, right? The first, which is sort of Benkler, the guy who coined the term peer production, really treats peer production as a collective action process, something that's trying to produce a public good. And the second, which is a newer trend of work, is work that really builds off the work of Elinor Ostrom, who's won the Nobel Prize, and who really studies sort of like what she will common pool resources. And so I think that very, very quickly, treating public peer production as a public good means that we rely on this like distinction between public goods and commons that comes from a bunch of work, including work that Ostrom did with her husband very early on. Public goods are generally speaking defined as being non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Ostrom used the term subtractable instead of rivalrousness, but non-excludable is relatively clear. It means you can't keep people out, or it's difficult to keep people out. Rivalrousness is a little bit more complicated, but it basically means that the good, if someone has the good, it doesn't keep someone else from having the good, right? And so you can think of like a traditional good as being actually like my laptop is actually quite excludable and quite rivalrous, in the sense that like I can put it in my bag or lock it in my house, and if you take it, I don't have it. Knowledge is neither of these things. Like, sorry, public goods are neither of these things. So something like national security, right, or useful knowledge are treated as sort of like archetypes of public goods. And generally speaking, people who are interested in public goods are concerned with provision, right? So you hear things like free discussions of free rider problems, right? How do we get people to contribute to the public good because someone else will just contribute to it, and once they've done it, anyone can have it, right? And so they end up being focused on selective incentives. Openness from a public goods perspective or a collective action perspective is like just an unmitigated like good, right? Because it's because closure is just a barrier to participation in the public good. So yeah, sure. Like, I mean, we got to figure out how to get people to contribute to it, but like, and that may be very hard, right? And we have to, maybe we'll create a state and tax people, and there's all kinds of ways in which public goods are provided. But barriers are never a good thing. Now, the commons perspective is very different. So a commons, I mean, what's similar in the sense that is not commons tend to be non-excludable or common pool resources. But the critical difference in the sort of like the thinking in political science and economics is that they're rivalrous. And so an example of a commons would be something like a library or an irrigation system or a fishery or a forest or a watershed. And as I mentioned, sort of Eleanor Ostrom is the like kind of intellectual boss in this space. And she did, her work was really about like going out into like fisheries and understanding like sort of how these things were built sort of effectively. And the commons perspective tends to not be concerned with provision. Ostrom did write a little bit about provision, but when she says provision in the context of like a fishery, she doesn't mean provision of the fish. You don't make the fish in the commons. You don't make the water in the watershed. What you do is you provide the institution, which is going to manage the fishery or the watershed, right? What you are concerned with is appropriation. Because if someone takes that fish out of the water, it's not there for the next person to take, right? If someone uses all the water for their water park or golf course, right, it's not there for the person that wants to do something else with it, right? And so you end up with, you know, conversations around things like enclosure of the commons or sort of overuse, right? The tragedy of the commons is this like very maligned, I think, like, and also like actually quite like misled, misleading and also like sort of misled like metaphor for thinking about what goes on in commons, because actually lots of commons work really well. But the tragedy of the commons is this idea that if people will be incentivized to take things out, and if people do take too much stuff out, you know, the fish are just not there anymore. Okay. Openness from a commons perspective is not treated as good. Ostrom's most important work is this book called Governing the Commons. And the most important part of the book is this like set of things that people refer to as the 8 principles. And you can think of it as like the 8 features of like highly effective commons. And number 1 on the list, number 1 is clearly defined boundaries, the ability to keep people out, right? And so that's a pretty different perspective on openness. So how should we think about openness, enclosure, and peer production? Well, I think that my suggestion is that understanding these dynamics of openness and closure involves reconciling these two perspectives. And here's my summary of what I've told you in the first chunk of the talk, right? I sort of said that I keep kind of going point, but I'll stay with the mic. I'll make shapes, right? So that why is Wikipedia so Wikipedia's contributor base has gone up and now is declining, right? Openness started out very high in Wikipedia and it became increasingly closed, right? That's like it's the little course, but that's the basic summary, right? So then the question I answer is why, and my answer, why is it doing this? And my answer to this is to sort of tease out a way, reconcile these two perspectives in a way, is to essentially think of it this way. Step 1, let's think of peer production projects as repositories of not just pure public goods, right? So yes, like I told you, the archetypical public good is knowledge. If I know something and I tell you that, you know it, and I still know it, right? Like you don't take away my knowledge by like having it know this, right? And encyclopedia articles like that. If you have a copy of that Wikipedia article, it's still there on Wikipedia and for anyone else, right? And so, yes, Wikipedia and peer production projects are repositories of software and maps and articles, but they're also forms of more diffuse forms of value, things like audience or goodwill or consistent quality. And you can think of that that stock of things like audience and goodwill and stuff like that as going up over time. And so this is getting at the point right now. Wikipedia in the early days didn't have a lot of articles. And even if it had a lot of articles, it didn't have a lot of people that trusted those articles. 2005, your teachers were telling you, don't look at Wikipedia, right? And that's changed. And that's a change in a kind of value, which I want to argue is not just a pure public good, and that work is actually sort of appropriable, which is to say some substantial portion of the value that Wikipedia has been created is not just and other peer production projects as well is appropriable value, and as a result sort of leads to like a kind of commons problem. But that doesn't exist at the beginning because the stock isn't there. You start out with one problem, which is building a stock of value. But to the extent that you become successful, which you almost never do, at building that stock of value, you gain a second problem, which is protecting that stock of value from appropriation. Okay, right, at the beginning, but not at the end. Protecting that stock becomes salient, often essential, but only later on, and only to the extent that you're successful at the first problem. So there's one thing I guess there's one more thing that I still haven't told you, which is actually really important. At least the question here is that what does value appropriation look like in Wikipedia? If appropriation in a fishery is taking a fish, what is it like? And I think that's actually like that's the if I can answer that question, the rest of the model, the rest of the model will work. So here's an example of value appropriation in Wikipedia. This is my argument. So this is the text of the article on Batman, and you can see someone who's replaced the entire text of the article Batman with Batman, and they got a laugh, presumably, and we get a laugh about it now because I'm showing it to you. But everyone who wanted to know anything factual about Batman for the period of time in which this was the article on Batman didn't get an answer to their question, right? I mean, I can summarize what happened here pretty easily, and I'm happy to share the video. But a company, North Face, hired an advertising company called Leo Burnett TaylorMade. Leo Burnett TaylorMade released this video to basically advertise their own advertising campaign. They were so proud of themselves. What they had done was they basically hired a bunch of photographers to go out to parks in South America and to take pictures of those parks with North Face gear prominently placed in each photo. And then they went to Wikipedia and replaced the photos on all of the parks about those parks in Wikipedia with their photos of the parks, but with North Face gear prominently displayed. There's a North Face backpack. This is a beautiful park. This is one of the pictures. And they released this video as a way of advertising about their advertising campaign. And it was basically like an SEO sort of thing, right? They were trying to the reason they did it was because if you searched for any of these parks, or really almost anything, the first thing in Google Images, and perhaps the first thing on the top of the search engine page, is a picture from Wikipedia. And they wanted to put their brand in it. And so they, quote, collaborated with Wikipedia. Now, there's a couple important bits here. One is that this is an entirely one-way collaboration. When Wikipedia administrators found out about this, right, they weren't happy about this, right? They deleted all of the images. The only reason I got this image was because I asked a friend who's an administrator on Wikipedia to share the image with me so I could include it in this talk, right? And in case it's not clear, Wikipedias don't like this because it's the trustworthy of Wikipedia relies on the fact that it's not just full of advertising, that people aren't writing or manipulating images to reflect their brand opinion, so on and so forth, right? And this is actually quite neutral, because this is just product advertising. It's just product placement.
But it's still a picture of the park, and it's
still a picture of the park, right? I'm like, they should have just cropped the person out of it, right? Anyway, the stakes are incredibly high. In one of the most extreme examples of this, a group of far-right Croatian nationalists completely captured governance in Croatian Wikipedia, and it became a site for Holocaust denialism, for essentially a bunch of just straight up misinformation about Balkan wars and Croatian war criminals, right? All these sorts of things. And anyone who disagreed with them got banned. The person whose job it was to investigate people abusing their power was also part of this. He's like, yeah, there's no, I checked, everything's fine, right? This is a report from the Wikimedia Foundation about this. It took 10 years to fix. And I actually I'll talk about more in this talk, because I actually have done I just have a paper coming out in CSCW about this. But I want to say this, but just the point is that this, the stakes are high. And I also want to point out that damage can come from good faith contributors. So this is the article on the Harlem Shake, which is it's like a dance, right? And the entire text of the article has been replaced with, oh God, I didn't need to delete it all, just one paragraph, please help, right? So this person like is trying to help, like appears to be trying to help. They're just like really not very good at editing Wikipedia yet. As they learn, anybody who wants to know anything about the Harlem Shake doesn't get an answer to their question. They just get a literal cry for help. And so again, that person's learning, hopefully, or just their mistakes along the way come at the expense of everyone else, right? So, all right, I have one final example. So people know who Jeremy Renner is. If you don't know who Jeremy Renner is, you can read the Wikipedia articles right up on the screen. He's an American singer-songwriter, velociraptor, film producer. Okay. The reason that I show this is all vandalism, right? It's like Wikipedia vandalism, incredibly common, is that it's not a one-off thing. Jeremy Renner's article has, for a period of about 10 years, been repeatedly vandalized to describe him as a velociraptor, implicitly or explicitly, like describing like what he eats, all these sorts of things. It seems to be, it's a meme. It's some group of people's hobby. Seems to be coordinated in a subreddit. But the reason I'm mentioning this is not because it's funny. I mean, it's also because it's funny, but it's primarily because of what have happened afterwards. User Top Banana protected the article due to persistent vandalism from a Reddit fad. And what protection means is that they locked the article. Literally, there's a lock at the top of the article. So there isn't an edit button on the Jeremy Renner article if for any user who's new or unregistered. What there is there's a view source button. You can see the source, but you can't actually change it. And so in response to vandalism, and this is getting at my argument, in response to actual attacks that are happening on this article, the thing is locked down. So, all right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a model that I've been working on. And this is actually like a formal mathematical model. This is like my sabbatical project. And I'm going to spare you the math, although I really want to talk about the math. So if you'd like to talk about the math, please find me. I'm super into this. So this is actually this model is sort of like the centerpiece of my my NSF career grant, which I've been working on for a couple of years now. And here's the basic idea. Think of every online community as having like you can think of every knowledge commons as having essentially two features. They have some stock of value and they have some amount of openness. And then every day they receive some set of they receive a packet in the mail. All right, something shows up on their doorstep, and it includes two kinds of things. It includes contributions, which are what I'm calling contributions, which basically are things that are going to increase the stock. You can think of them as good contributions, and it includes damage. Those are things that's like vandalism. That could be good. That could be the Harlem Shake thing, someone trying to help, but just really bad at it and making things much worse in the process. Damage, and those things will decrease the stock, right? And what they can do at the end of the day is that communities, they can make a choice to become more or less open based on whatever that they showed up. And the argument is that that both contributions and damage are going to be positive functions of openness and stock. Which is to say that there's openness kind of makes sense, right? The more open you are, the more good stuff you'll get, but also the more bad stuff you'll get, right? You're more susceptible to that. And you can close, but and maybe when you close, you block more of the bad stuff than the good stuff, but you can't block none of the good stuff, right? There's always going to be a little bit of collateral damage. So that's the first insight, right? The second insight is this idea that it's a positive function of stock, which is to say that there's a virtuous cycle, right? The more you've built, the more goodwill you have, the more people know about your website, the more they want to come and contribute, right? In good ways. But there's also a vicious cycle. The more they know about your website, the more they trust you, the more you're at the top of that Google search engine, the more North Face wants to get their stuff on there. And so does everybody else. So at the beginning, you start out really open, but you don't have any stock. Well, if you don't start out really open, your chance of getting any stock is pretty low. But if you do, hey, good news, you got some contributions. Those contributions increase the stock. But because you have you have a stock, well, you got that virtuous cycle. The next day, you're not just going to get what you got the last day, you're going to get even more because you got more stuff in there. More people know about you, want to contribute, but you're also going to attract some bad stuff. And in response to that bad stuff, you're going to turn the openness dial down a little bit. And as a result, you get a little bit less good, you get less bad stuff, good news, but you also get less bad stuff. That's the basic insight. And so this is just a simulation with some parameters from the model that are sort of like tuned to things that are some empirical stuff that I'll show you the empirical work in a second. But basically, this just walks you through the kind of the intuition here. And it's just what I've sort of suggested, right? Like the more contributions you get, the more that stock gets up. But also the more bad stuff that starts showing up as well, the damage starts to increase. In order to block the damage, you become increasingly closed. And what ends up happening now, that the actual like how high that stock gets, how long it takes for this to play out, those are all things can be functions of like the way in which you like sort of adjust those trade-offs. Like what is the relative the relative efficiency, for example, of the good stuff versus the bad stuff. All these things matter. But in this model, this is the what ends up happening is, well, what ends up happening is the community becomes increasingly closed. Basically, you build a stock of value, and you can either not care about it, in which case things will just go off the rails, and the stock goes away. But the optimal strategy, right? If you solve for openness, right? Like in these equations, and you do the thing, you basically, like if you are as open as necessary to maximize that stock, the optimal strategy will be one in which you become increasingly closed. Begin really open and become increasingly closed. And the end result is that stuff goes into amber, basically. So what about random chance? Like, I'm so glad I asked. Randomness and virtuous cycle dynamics. Like basically, there's a couple of really nice things about randomness. One is that you end up with, because there's this virtuous cycle dynamics, that it means that randomness means that you can reproduce this massive inequality in terms of number of participants across projects that we see in peer production. This is like an empirical feature, right? So some communities are really, really, really big, like Wikipedia. The vast majority of them are actually really quite small, and you see huge inequality. That's a function of these sort of power law distributions through this like sort of preferential attachment. This kind of like the winners. It's basically the success breeds success kind of dynamics, right? That's a thing which will emerge from this, from uncertainty in this space. And then I've already mentioned it also suggests that the optimal strategy in this case is to begin really open and to become increasingly closed over time. So I'll talk a little bit about why I'm not as bummed out about that as I was like 2 years ago. But before I do that, I want to show you some. I'm actually like, so despite like basically having this has all been like very substantive focused and theoretical so far. And I'm actually like an empirical social scientist. Almost all my work is like building data sets of things and doing kind of like I'm like doing kind of data scientific studies of communities. So I'm going to show you a little bit of that work as a way of helping answer 3 questions about the model. First is that like, does damage increase with value? The second question is, do communities become less open in the face of damage? And the third is that does changes in openness reduce both, do they have this collateral damage feature, this sort of contributions to damage? And actually, if any of these things are not true, it's a problem for the model. So because these are all things that the model sort of assumes will happen or predicts will happen. Okay, first, does damage increase as communities increase in value? So I already mentioned the case of Croatian Wikipedia, right? This is the new paper that is led by Zareen Karazian, who's a PhD student in human-centered design and engineering at the University of Washington, also co-authored with her co-advisor, Kate Starberg, who's a misinformation researcher. You can see this is kind of like in the middle of our like wheelhouses. It's sort of about like a disinformation campaign in a peer production community. This, as I suggested, the Wikimedia Foundation sort of explained what happened already. So this paper was not actually concerned with documenting what happened. It was more explained to answering a slightly different question, which is that like, why did it happen in Croatian Wikipedia and not in the 4 other collaborative Wikipedia editions, which are in the same language, the Serbo-Croatian language, right? So there's a Serbo-Croatian Wikipedia, which is existed first. There's Serbian Wikipedia, which is in a different script. It's in Cyrillic, but and then there's Bosnian Wikipedia. And they all have challenges and problems. Every large online community and every Wikipedia does. But Croatian Wikipedia was captured in a way that the others weren't. And so our question was why, and we answered that question, but this was an interview-based study. So we interviewed a bunch of people that have been participated in all of these communities, and the fact that they can read each other's wikis was very helpful. And also a bunch of people that had participated in kind of cross-wiki sort of monitoring systems and who had dealt with the issue. And the first, and we came up with the result of this work was essentially 3 propositions, 3 explanations. The first explanation was that the reason Croatian Wikipedia was captured and the other ones weren't was because Croatian Wikipedia was like valuable. It had like a sort. It was a source of value in a way that at least two of the other ones, Serbo-Croatian and Bosnian, weren't. Bosnian was not valuable. Sorry, well, Serbo-Croatian wasn't valuable for two reasons. One, it was kind of small. But there are lots of Serbo-Croatian speakers. The bigger issue was that it didn't actually correspond to any nationalist, like it didn't resonate. It didn't like, no one thought of themselves as a Serbo-Croatian. Maybe like they might have thought of themselves as a Yugoslav, like that country hasn't existed for some time. And so because it didn't correspond to a nationalist identity, it wasn't attractive for a nationalist like movement in the same way that the other ones were. Bosnian was just small. There just weren't a lot of viewers there was a small audience for Bosnian Wikipedia. And Bosnian is actually just a much smaller language. There are fewer Bosnians than there are Serbs or Croats. Basically, the punchline was that damage, the worst kind of damage, is only an issue when people care, when there's enough people there to care. And they don't always care, right? No, it's not that Bosnian wasn't capturable. It's that nobody wanted to capture it. Or the Serbo-Croatian, definitely the case of Serbo-Croatian. All right. So this is a different slide that makes the same point. This is the number of estimated damaging edits per day. This is from a random sample of edits made to English Wikipedia, and there's a machine learning system that the Wikimedia Foundation has built called ORS. It basically like estimates whether or not an article is likely to be damaging, and it's used for mostly anti-vandalism work and people building bots and tool-assisted editing, flagging, that kind of stuff. And what you can see is that the estimated number of bad edits that are being like damaging edits that are being made to Wikipedia has gone up enormously in a period that peaks right before, as it turns out, like look at that dot, like right before March 2007, and declined substantially afterwards. But of course, as I showed you, volume of edits is also going up during this period, so that might be part of the answer. It's a different way of showing something similar. This is the proportion of all edits made to English Wikipedia that are damaging, and this is from a hand-coded sample. I didn't hand-code it. I got this data from Aaron Hofker, who did that Rise and Declines paper. They shared with me a sample that they'd used. It's a really nice hand-coded sample, and then I just did some new analysis on it. What you can see is that you went from a period in like 2003 or 2004 where there were like, I don't know, maybe about 5% of edits to Wikipedia were sort of damaging or like sort of like or vandalism, to a period around the time in which it's blocked where it was like 30%, right? So you go from having like hundreds or thousands of damaging edits a day to like tens of thousands. So there was an actual increase. Wikipedia's closure correspond to a like massive increase in not just the raw number of people like sort of trying to damage the system in various ways, but actually like a huge percentage increase in the proportion of people trying to do this as well, right? So again, kind of good evidence in favor of that dynamic in the model. Okay, second question. Do comments become less open as they grow? That's also kind of important for the model to work. I already hinted at this when I talked about that Laboratories of Oligarchy paper that I wrote, which about the oligarchic leadership. This is again not from Wikipedia, but from these 800 or so large Wikia wikis. I've done some work with lots of the other ones too. I'm just showing work from this sample of the big ones. And what you can see is the top graph is these are model predicted probabilities from the paper, and it's just the chance of a community adding a new administrator, putting a person in power based on the number of people that are contributing to that community. And there's no limit to the number of people that can be administrators in these wikis, right? You can have, everyone can be, if you contribute to my wiki and you're not a vandal, you become an administrator automatically. I run like an anarchist wiki. Just like, please, someone else help me. And you can see that you go from being extremely unlikely to add a new administrator to basically like, it's just never going to happen. Similarly, you see that administrators, the administrators become substantially more likely over time to undo the work of essentially good faith contributors, right? So real evidence of closure happening in the context of these communities on average. This is just a graph of I didn't draw the 2007 line in there, but you can see that point is right before March 2007. This is the number of articles which are being protected. So remember I showed you that Jeremy Renner article which got locked down. This is the number of articles which are being locked down. And so some of these locks are expiring and then could be locked again. Many of them never expire. They're just like permanently locked down as well. And you can see that this increases and peaks around 2007 as well. So you see real evidence of closure, actual sort of like organizational closure that seems to correspond to increases in vandalism over time as well. Okay, the third question. Does decreases in openness and damage, this is actually the key dynamic in the model, right? Does decreases in openness, do they have this collateral damage thing? Do they block both the good stuff and the bad stuff? I have this paper where I looked at one particular intervention. So this is a set of 140 Wikia or fandom wikis that all made the same policy change. They all basically started requiring accounts in order for people to contribute to the wiki. And what we found was exactly this dynamic that we looked at. And actually this experience in this paper is really what like is probably the single thing that inspired most of the rest of this thinking, that as these communities like basically it worked really well. As these communities like in order to they had vandalism, you saw existence of vandalism, they basically decided to start requiring accounts because they noticed a feature which is also true in Wikipedia, which is that the large majority of vandalism comes from people without accounts. And so they basically said, we're going to require an account. It's going to create, people have to create a persistent identity. There's lots of good like social science that says that people will be more connected to the community and it's a barrier to entry, all these sorts of things. And it deterred something like 70% of the bad edits. But it also deterred something like 20 to 40% of the good edits. And that's the second graph down here. And the problem is that there's a lot more good edits than bad edits. So actually for every bad edit which you actually deter 7 good edits. That was our estimate on average within this community. I will point out Wikipedia, like in the last 2 years, Farsi Wikipedia and Portuguese Wikipedia have made the same change. I think one of them, maybe Farsi, I forget which one. One of them has actually undone it as a result. And I've been very involved in a lot of conversations with these communities about their like helping them inform using like sort of like, we've studied this, like we've learned some things from this. Maybe you want to think about that trade-off, right? And I think whether or not the trade-off is like, I'm not going to tell you that trade-off is good or bad, right? Like how bad was that bad edit, right? If that bad edit was worse than 7 good edits, like, yeah, maybe it's worth the trade-off, right? Like my sense is that's probably not the case, but it's hard to see. The problem is that the bad stuff is very easy to see when it happens. The good stuff that never happens, very hard to see. That's just always the problem. And actually, when I was talking to people, the reason I did this project was because a person who's an administrator on one of these wikis, Muppet Wiki, the Muppet Wiki basically said, I'm confident this worked. It was a good thing. And I came back later and be like, hey, on average, it didn't work. But it's hard to see that. And here's why. Okay. So when I started thinking about this problem, let's say like 4 years ago, I basically was thinking closure's bad. Like, how do we stop it? And I want to speak to this and to the broader question of what I think we should do with 2 final examples from my research, one of which we've already seen. So the first is a piece of an example of the simplest answer to the dilemma that we can think of is like, all these administrators are consolidating power. They're cutting off the lifebloods of their community. If we just fired all those admins, people would be able to contribute and communities would be able to grow. Wouldn't that be just so great? Well, turns out someone did this, sort of. There's this project called Wikitravel, which is a travel guide, kind of like Lonely Planet. And Wikitravel wrote a whole bunch of articles between 2003 and 2012 or so. And then Wikitravel at that point in 2012 got bought by this company called Internet Brands, which I think that like has been characterized by people as kind of like a company that strip mines the internet. They basically buy online communities that are big, like Flyer Talk's one of them. They bought like one of these big medical information ones. And they basically run as many ads as possible while, according to at least the participants in their community, doing as little to support the technical and social infrastructure of those communities. And so people within the Wikitravel community became pretty annoyed by that. And they said, hey, Wikimedia Foundation, would you be willing to just host a copy of our site? We'd all like to move somewhere else. Internet Brands reacted to this by threatening to sue all of their core contributors, which caused anyone who was on the fence about whether or not they wanted to move to like kind of make up their mind, and they all just left. And so what ended up happening was this really funny thing, right? There's like a lot of online communities are characterized by these like strong core periphery dynamics, relatively smart, this 80-20 kind of thing, like a small group of people making a really large number of edits and then a large number of other people on the periphery. This is like, but they always come together, right? Like you ended up with a situation where you had one community, Wikitravel, which after the split, well, I say Wiki Voyage, let's start with them. Wiki Voyage had the core. All of the really active contributors went to Wiki Voyage. But Wikitravel, like all the people searching on the internet, like for a travel guide, like didn't get the memo. And they showed up to the website and they continued to contribute their content there. And so what you ended up with was this, as you can see, this is the graph of the two websites a year after the split. And sure enough, WikiVoyage has, which is the one in the like kind of the WikiVoyage is the dark purple, lots of core members. WikiTravel, far fewer. And in fact, many of them are actually internet brands like employees who are just like kind of cleaning, just doing basic kind of like maintenance stuff. Whereas the peripheral members, exactly the opposite dynamic, right? Like you really have this weird situation. And the answer is a real trade-off. The top one is the difference after about a year. Oh, this is, I should say, this is work that was led by Ellie Ross, or Ellie Mercedes Ross, who's a PhD from the University of Washington, working with me, and is the one who's really led this work. And what she showed in the work was that, what she's showing in this work was that that after a year, the differences in terms of the size of the articles, the WikiVoyage articles, the ones in the one with the core only, right? They're shorter articles. They're growing less quickly. There's less new content being contributed. The periphery is contributing a bunch of new information. But if you look at a measure of quality, which is something like, in this case, it's listing, and the details are, you can think of it as like, there's like how much information is on the page, and then there's like how much of that information is well structured. Does it have like, for a travel guide, does it have like the phone number and like the, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? That the structure, the measure of structure, that's much higher in the one with the core, right? And so the answer seems to be that that there's a real trade-off, that they're both contributing value, but it's actually different kinds of value, right? Quality from the core, but important new kinds of contributions from the periphery. And if we flip back to those graphs that I showed you before, I want to say that it doesn't look great for either of these. If anything, the peripheral members on WikiVoyage are going up, but it's very slow, which is to say that like neither of these seem like great answers. Maximizing openness, if that's what we think of as WikiTravel doing, like it's kind of like no rules, parents are gone, right? Like quality takes a hit. And only parents or whatever, like very high quality. We're kind of like polishing our little, like block the doors. We're enjoying and the stuff in here is very good and never going to grow. Okay, let's go back to that Serbo-Croatian answer, because there was a thing that I didn't answer, which is like, okay, great, I gave you an answer, my answer for the situation in Serbo-Croatian and in Bosnian, but what about Serbian? Serbian's about as big, if anything, a little bit bigger than Croatian Wikipedia. There's certainly plenty of Serbian nationalists, right? Like it's not like that's not a nationalist identity. And the answer there comes to the other two parts of our explanation. And the differentiator in this case was not closure per se, but specifics of how the governance system was closed. Serbian was more open than Croatian when it came to participation in governance. They were open along some dimensions, but they were definitely less open when it came to formalization of rules, precisely because the formalization limited power. So for example, on Serbian Wikipedia, there has been for many years a policy about how to remove an administrator. There was a policy about like when a person should be banned and how a person can appeal their ban. There, at least until very recently, and maybe still, are not policies on those things in Croatian Wikipedia at all. And so the absence of formalization in rules actually created opportunities for governing, for capture of governance system, right? So the answer here is that, so what I'm suggesting is that it's not about openness. The openness and closure is maybe like a little bit too like a coarse of a way of thinking about this, right? That openness and closure is important, and closure, but it matters. The specific ways in which you become closed really matters. So, what I want to say, and what I'm suggesting here is that, you know, this is my journey, right? From a world in which like, oh my gosh, closure is bad, how do we stop it? To more of this question of like, how do we manage openness to effectively sustain those commons? That, you know, what I presented at bad news at the beginning was maybe not, it's not that it's not bad, it's bad, but maybe it's not like worth maybe it's not worth thinking about it in terms of like bad, like, yeah, it's complicated, that's right. Or rather it's bad in some ways, but it might be the best that we can do. Or the closure and decline create a real process of navigating a real set of trade-offs. And thinking about it in bad news is maybe not the most helpful way. So what I think we should do instead is think about closure as an adaptive institutional response, and a movement that we can build maps of these sort of mobilization and governance trade-offs, like the one that I've sort of begun to start teasing out in that qualitative work on Croatian, and how those things sort of shift over communities' life cycles, because the kinds of challenges that you face early on are not the same as the challenges you face at the beginning, and are not the challenges that you face early on. So I have a couple, like, I don't know, this is like, I think my last slide. I think I have a couple ideas of things that projects can do. I think we should, embrace the fact that our goals are intention, that we have two goals: building a stock of knowledge and maintaining the quality of that stock of knowledge. And these things are not, they're actually intentional. We have to like make real trade-offs. We can think about the challenges. We can think about how those things face over time. We can take a more dynamic life cycle view. And I think that we can think about openness as a filter, and we can think about improving the performance of that filter, right? To the extent that we think of openness as a way of like identifying the good stuff or the bad stuff, well, if we just get better at doing that, if we think about it in like improve the precision and the recall, right? Like that's actually just like, that's an unmitigated good, if we can do that. So we can in some sense reduce the cost of a bad thing relative to a good thing. So that's what I prepared. It's not a lot more time here, but I'm hanging out for a little bit. I really appreciate you all coming out for this, and I would love to continue this conversation.